So in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Lord Jesus, when you multiplied the loaves and fishes, you provided more than food for the body. You offered us the gift of yourself, the gift which satisfies every hunger and quenches every thirst. Your disciples were filled with fear and doubt, but you poured out your love and compassion on the migrant crowd, welcoming them as brothers and sisters. Lord Jesus, today you call us to welcome the members of God's family who come to our land to escape oppression, poverty, persecution, violence, and war. Like your disciples, we too are filled with fear and doubt and even suspicion. We build barriers in our hearts and in our minds. Lord Jesus, help us by your grace to banish fear from our hearts, that we may embrace each of your children as our own brother and sister, to welcome migrants and refugees with joy and generosity while responding to their many needs, to realize that you call all people to your holy mountain to learn the ways of peace and justice, to share of our abundance as you spread a banquet before us, to give witness to your love for all people as we celebrate the many gifts they bring. We praise you and give you thanks for the family you have called together from so many people. We see in this human family a reflection of the divine unity of the one most holy Trinity, in whom we make our prayer. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. So I want to just say a word of thanks to our Social Concerns Committee, who've really been the primary instigators in bringing this evening together. And with a special thank you to Phil and Jane Argento, who reached out, who are longtime friends of Father Sean, and reached out and were really able to plan all of this and organize this event tonight. And without them, this wouldn't have been possible. So I'm going to introduce Jane Argento, who's going to introduce Father Sean.
Thank you, Cambria. Well, this is sort of a treat to be able to introduce Father Sean tonight. It was just one of the great experiences of my life to spend 3.5 years helping with some projects at Dolores Mission. And I was there, I think, for about a year when Father Sean came as the associate pastor. And I don't think I've ever said this to him, but it was really obvious very soon that he saw the magic of Dolores Mission and developed a real love and devotion for all the people there, but especially those who had immigrated from various countries in Latin America. So to say the things that would interest us, Father Sean is a graduate of Stanford. He recently, in 1988, he met the Jesuits there, and he joined the community in 1989. He was ordained in 2000. More recently, he received his global executive MBA at Georgetown, which I'm sure helps with the management and all of the work that goes into the Kino Border Initiative. It was also just a delight for me when I was at Dolores Mission to hear bits and pieces about the early planning days of what became the Kino Border Initiative and the commitment of at the time, the California province of the Jesuits, and also the Mexican province of the Jesuits, and various dioceses in Arizona, and sisters who across the border that Father Sean will tell us about. That it has really become an amazing program and an amazing a contribution to the work with the migrants at the border. And so I don't want to take any more time, but Father Sean.
Well, I just want to thank Holy Family Parish again, and this really opportunity to be with you all this weekend. And like I said, I think at Mass at the 5:30, it was my first time actually presiding at a liturgy here. And I'd heard about Holy Family over the years during my time at Dolores Mission, and just what a wonderful partnership and really sister parish relationship has had with Dolores Mission. And so just great to finally to be here and to actually meet the members of this community and to do that in this role that I have working in the Kino Border Initiative. So I was just thinking before stepping up here of a parish that I went to some years ago, and the pastor was away for the weekend, and so I had all the liturgies. And so I pull up to the parking lot, and I turn off the ignition, and I'm sitting there silently in the car, and I kind of look up to God, and I say, I'm going to get it, or they're going to let me have it. And so why did I say that? Well, the gospel that Sunday was the gospel of the Good Samaritan, and if we remember that story, remember that parable in Luke where the most likely people to stop to help the person beaten up on the side of the road, the priest and the Levite, keep walking, and for good reasons. It's the Samaritan, the most unlikely person who stops and provides for that person's needs. So I get up in front of the congregation, and so I start my homily, and I say, well, who is the person in the ditch? Well, among those people in the ditch in our midst is the undocumented immigrant. And a woman in the back of the church stood up, and she let it rip. She was just yelling at me and screaming at me, and they're this and they're that and they're other thing, and I was just kind of taken aback, and so I said, well, the gospel's hard, it's challenging, but a real invitation is to grapple with it, kind of similar to what Monsignor was saying this morning at the 9:30 Mass, that spirit of openness. But then something really amazing happened at the end of Mass, that everybody was talking about the issue and grappling with the issue and grappling with the church's teaching on the issue. So hopefully no one yells at me this evening. So but I do hope that we have, and if you do, it's okay, it's all right. But I do hope that we're able to grapple with the issue a little more, and that we're able to, as we say at KBI for people who come, hopefully humanize the issue and complicate it a little bit for us, but complicate it in a good way. So I just want to start just also by just talking a little bit about the people that we serve there, because it really, I think, gives a good insight into the people that come and why they come. We had a visit from one of the county supervisors in Tucson. He came down one day to our center. So Kino Border Initiative, what is it? Well, it's this binational work, and we really work in three areas: humanitarian assistance, education, research, and advocacy. I mentioned a little bit at the liturgies, but we have really two main humanitarian projects. One is a center where we provide meals, clothing, pastoral support, first aid, and we document abuses. Just a whole variety of services take place there because those are just great needs that migrants have. And then we have a shelter for women and children because of their particular vulnerability. We also recognize that while humanitarian service is so important, that if we're not raising awareness, and if we're not trying to change the policies so that they are more humane, that they are more just, then we're missing a fundamental part of the response that's really needed to this reality. So I took this county supervisor to our center one morning. It's this module built into the hillside right across the port of entry in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. And we sat down, and the corridor was full of people, and they had just had their meal. And we happened to sit down with a man from El Salvador, and he spent about 50 minutes sharing with us his experience of how he came to Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. So he was a fisherman, and that's how he made his living in El Salvador. And yet, as happens to so many, organized crime accused him of doing something that he hadn't done. And so one day after he had gotten back and he pulled his boat up onto the shore, and he's getting ready to end the day, and he's surrounded immediately by people involved in organized crime. They beat him with baseball bats. They beat him within an inch of his life. He crawled home. I mean, literally crawled home. And it took him 3 months to recover. And he just lied in bed at his home. I mean, just beaten to a pulp. When he recovered, he tried to go back to work, but they threatened him again. And it was just clear to him that he couldn't have a life there. And so he picked up his belongings and he fled, and even in fleeing, risked his life enormously, moving through various territories of organized criminal groups in El Salvador, and then making his way through Guatemala. Hopefully that's not Jesus telling me I'm done. So it's happened before. So, but he took that train north, and waiting for the train to come by the railroad tracks, people came by and beat him up. I mean, it's just indescribable suffering that he experienced. And so when he got to Nogales, Sonora, it just became very clear to me and to us who were listening to him why he had come. And really, I think, reflects the current reality that we're seeing, which is so many families coming north, and not just from Central America, but especially from the Mexican states of Guerrero in particular, and Nogales, but also people from Michoacan and Zacatecas who are coming as well. I'd say the biggest change that we've seen over these years happened a year ago last summer. So for many years, we were receiving mostly people deported from the U.S. to Mexico. About 75% men, and about 20 to 25% women and children. A very small number who were actually making their way north into the United States from Mexico. But a year ago, this past summer, we started to see a very large number of families arriving in Nogales. And what happened is that as they arrived at the port of entry, and as customs was slow to receive them, the number of people increased and increased and increased to the point where there were about 100 people. I mean, just imagine, it's families, and probably half were children. Hadn't bathed, and really many had fled violence and were really uncertain about what was next, and very unfamiliar with the asylum process. And so we were doing what we could to provide for the food and their humanitarian needs, and Mexican migration threatened to deport them. And so what we did was we put a list together, and this is something that's happening frequently along the border between the U.S. and Mexico. It's done various ways, but the way we did it was we set up a list, and the people who were in the front of the line, we put their names and how many children that they had, and then that way they could stay in other shelters or make other arrangements while they waited to present themselves at the port of entry. So right now in Nogales, Sonora, there are about 700 people waiting to present themselves at the port of entry. They're mostly from Mexico, and we're seeing an increasing number of Cubans and Venezuelans. It's actually a very small number of Central Americans right now. And I'd say the main reason for that is because of Mexican law enforcement operations, particularly what they call the National Guard, or the Guardia Nacional, who is deployed along the southern border of Mexico with Central America, and they're keeping most people from Central America, at least, from arriving in Nogales. But Venezuelans and Cubans fly in, and then they make their way north. So the reality, the demographic has really shifted from mostly deportees, mostly men, small number of women and children, to families, many fleeing violence. And I'd say of the 700 people that we're serving, probably close to half are children. And so And so this has been the biggest and the most fundamental change that we have seen. And yet, as I look at this reality, it really takes me back to many years ago when I was part of the needs assessment process for what would become the Kino Border Initiative. So Jane didn't mention, but I wore actually 2 hats for my last 2 years at Dolores Mission. So I was associate pastor, but I also worked for our province as we call the pastoral ministries assistant, which meant being a liaison between the 12 parishes in our province and trying to be a resource and support to them in our provincial. So in that role, our province had a real interest in beginning a binational, or not, that wasn't even binational, had a real interest in responding somehow to the reality of migration as it was lived on the border. So what we were seeing at that time were many people coming through Arizona, many people dying in the desert, and a lot of contentiousness around the issue, much like we see today. And what we wondered is there something we can do to help? Is there something that we can do as Jesuits to respond to this need? And so we went and interviewed a whole variety of people in that region of southern Arizona and northern Sonora. And we asked 2 very simple questions. What are the greatest needs, and do you think we can help? So I don't know if any of you are social scientists or professors, and you have your long survey, and you calculate your standard deviation, and you do your data analysis. No, we had 2 questions, really simple. And as we asked these questions to a whole variety of people, we heard a pattern in terms of the responses. We heard that Nogales was a central point of deportation along the U.S.-Mexican border. We heard that women and children were in particular vulnerability to abuse and exploitation. And we heard many times a need and desire for safe spaces to dialogue about this issue, much like we're trying to do this evening, particularly in communities of faith. Can we find spaces where we can grapple with this issue, where we can grapple with the church's message on this issue? And mostly, can we humanize this issue? Can we see and recognize and experience the human person who lives this experience of migration or who has lived through it? And take that into account when we are reflecting on our policies and practices with regard to immigration to the United States. And we also heard if we were going to do something, it needed to be cross-border. It wasn't going to be enough just to be a U.S. or Mexican project, but really something that literally crossed the border. So we took all that together and developed the proposal for the project that I just described earlier. But being good Ignatian, trying to be good Ignatian people, we went back to groups and said, this is what we heard, what do you think? And really what we were doing was not just asking these groups of people, what do you think? We were asking, God, are you calling us here? God, are you inviting us here? And are you inviting us to do it in this way? And the response was overwhelming affirmation. And it'd be hard to pick a worse time to begin a new initiative than 2008, for obvious reasons. But we trusted the discernment. We trusted that God was working in the process, and that God was speaking through the people that we interviewed. And we said, well, if this is God's call, then we need to do our part, but God will bless it and God will find a way. And that's really been our experience over these years. So last year we served over 55,000 meals. We served over 11,000 people. I think last year this year we've served 82,413 people. So that's about 26,000 people more than we served all last year, and that's as of the end of August, which really speaks to the number of people that we're seeing coming to the border and who are coming with great needs. We also hosted 50 what we call immersion experiences. So these are experiences of direct service, dialogue, and reflection. We're not interested in just service experiences where people come and they want to build something or paint something, which is obviously helpful and important. But we're really very interested in facilitating an experience in which people have an opportunity to dialogue with a whole variety of people, whether it's Border Patrol or ranchers or the migrants themselves or members of the Ambos Nogales community. And to have nightly spaces of reflection where they really grapple with what they've seen and heard. And for the faith-based groups, which is the majority of the groups that we served, to reflect on that in the context of faith. So that afterwards, they're really thinking about, how can I tell the story? How can I share the story of the person who I met in our Comodore, in our center? How can I share the story of walking in the desert and seeing backpacks strewn on the ground, and associating those with the people that I met, the migrants that I met in Nogales, Sonora? How can I volunteer? How can I serve in some way? And how can I advocate? We've had some powerful examples of advocacy that students have participated in over the years. And just to give you an example, some months ago, the DREAM Act, that Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was proposals to make that the law of the land were in Congress. And we had students at Brophy College Preparatory with call-in days, calling their legislative representatives, urging them to pass the DREAM Act, to pass a Clean Dream Act, and really trying to recognize that our young people are a blessing. And if they have that path to legal status in the U.S., not only does it respect their dignity and their rights, but also it makes it enables them more fully to make a greater contribution to the United States. I'd say one of the great surprises of the Kino Board Initiative is a program called Kino Teens. So in 2009, we received a grant for $5,000 from the U.S. Bishops Conference. And with that money, we formed a club at a local Catholic high school in Nogales, Arizona. And with that money, this club blossomed and grew to the point where they were giving presentations to Jesuit high schools in Northern California. They were serving migrants in our center, and they were making advocacy visits. So I remember one visit, we were in one senator's office, and typically on those visits, when you arrive for an advocacy visit, you sit there and you introduce yourselves. But what happened there is that instead of the extended introductions and talking about the issues, they brought a photo album, and they showed the staffer photos of migrants, and through their stories, then pushed them to pass a comprehensive, urged the senator to support a comprehensive immigration reform proposal. And I think for these young people, that was just very powerful. Obviously, we haven't seen that reality yet, but I think it's really helped engage young people to the point where we have 11 of these clubs around the U.S. So one thing I want to talk about this evening as well is, I think obviously we have different images of the border. We have different impressions of the border. We have different, obviously, views with respect to migration. And I would say certainly what we see in the media is a view or an imagination that's really heavily focused on border security. And while security obviously is important, I think it's a very limited imagination of the border and the reality that's there. Because I think what can happen is that we can miss what's happening there, and that most of all, we can miss the presence and the reality of the human person and the dignity of that human person too. You know, one thing that the church talks about is people have a right to a dignified way of life where they live. And that's rooted in their human dignity because they're made in God's image and likeness. And that if they can't have that dignified way of life, they have a right to migrate to a place where they can. While countries can have borders and have the right to sovereignty, it's not a right that can be exercised at the expense of human dignity. And also, as part of that dignity, it is respect for refugees and for undocumented people in our midst. You know, one thing Pope Francis talks about, or has talked about, is the story of the rich man. You know, and I think that's right after the Good Samaritan story that I talked about earlier. And that, you know, the rich man who walks by the man begging by the door. And that afterwards, when they both die, he sees that beggar, in glory, and he's not, and says, well, why can't I be with you? And the reason is because he never saw him. He never saw him. And so I think part of our imagination of the border, it's, can we see the person most affected by this reality? Do we just see a problem, or can we also see a person? Because, like I said earlier, if we can see the person, then that really shifts the way that we approach this issue and understand it. I've written about this experience that I have in the Commodore, and it's an experience I continue to have, and it's a very simple thing, and yet very profound, and I think reflects kind of the point that I'm trying to make here. And it's arriving at our center on a given morning, and if you see people standing outside there, whether they're families who have come north or people who have been deported, and if you look at them, their body language really communicates what they've been experiencing, what they've been going through. You know, the depression, the uncertainty, the fear. And yet when they come through the door, something really shifts. Because they're welcomed, they're greeted, they're seated. Those who are visiting are introduced to them. But what happens is that afterwards, I have the opportunity to bless the meal. And so I get up before them, and as a priest, you do this all the time, right? Father, can you bless the meal? So this is no different. And yet there's something different about it when I do it there. Because when I start, and I do it in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and start with that prayer, as I'm looking at all of you, I look over the migrants and I see heads bow, I see hands folded. But what's more important than what I see is what I feel. And what I feel in that moment is the migrants opening their hearts to God, opening their beings to God, and letting God in to that place of uncertainty and fear and doubt and hope as well. And what they're teaching me to do, and I think teaching us who are there in that moment, is to do the same thing. Which is hard to do. And yet when we open our hearts, like Pope Francis says, if we just crack open the doors of our hearts just a little bit, that's enough for God to come in. And I think when we can do that, then we start to imagine the border, we start to see the border, and we start to see this reality in a little bit of a different way. Because we don't just see it from our minds, though that's an important part of it. But we also see it from our hearts too. And from our hearts informed by that movement of God's Spirit. And so what's possible when that happens? What's possible when that happens is that, when we serve the meal to the migrants and they're serving tortillas and they're eating beans and rice and scrambled eggs, and that's not just a meal happening there, but it's Eucharistic. There's a breaking of the bread. There's a vulnerability. There's a experience of being fed spiritually. And it's Jesus breaking himself open for us gathered there in that moment. Two people, one from the U.S., one from Mexico, washing dishes together. If you look at that, it's just, they're just cleaning up after the meal. But with that different imagination, we see solidarity. We see accompaniment. And we see recognition that this person is my sister and brother. And when we gather on Holy Thursday and we wash each other's feet, that it's not just this gesture of washing each other's feet, but it's a glimpse of the kingdom of God, where whatever our background is or whatever our experiences have been, that in the end, we are God's daughters and sons. And we get a glimpse of that vision of what's coming in the life to come. So I think if we have this new imagination, if you will, and this new vision, it even helps us conceive policy a little differently. Perhaps with this new vision, we would, yes, value public safety, but try to do it in a way that if we can pass comprehensive immigration reform, then we can use fewer resources more strategically to respond to the particular threats that exist on the border. That with this new imagination, we can have a renewed effort to protect human rights, especially of children, and not separate them from their families and cause the trauma that's happening to these young boys and girls, our daughters and sons. And that we can also welcome residents and newcomers, and do that through renewed access to the asylum process, through more lanes at the port of entry, more visas in areas of need where there's an economic need in the U.S. and people willing to work to address those needs, more visas for family reunification. Then these are some of the policies that are consistent with really that broader vision of what the border is, and informs that view of the immigration system as well. So where are we going? Well, there are a few things that are lighting our way. One is that last summer we bought a building across the street from our current facility. And we've spent this past year remodeling it. And now we're getting ready this fall to move in. So where we've had this module of 400 square feet, now we're going to have 19,600 square feet. Whereas we've a dining area for 80 people, maybe 90, right now it'll be 160. Where we've had a shelter for maybe 12 to 17 women and children, now we're going to have it for 36 to 40. Where some men have had to sleep on the streets or in the cemetery or in other places, now we'll have a shelter for 72 men. Where there are people who've been deported and are wondering what to do and what's next and how can I have a life in Nogales, Sonora, we're starting a livelihood project where we do an assessment of what are their interests and what would they like to do and what skills do they have. And then help them get the documents in order to be able to find a job, to be trained for those jobs, to look at the logistics of finding a place to live, getting from there to their place of work and back in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. And then the whole accompaniment part too, meeting with them once a month or forming a sharing group of people who are migrants and who are working in Nogales, Sonora, so that they can support one another in that experience and the ups and downs that come with adjusting to that reality. And expanding what we call our Legal Fellow program. We have a partnership with the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project. We've seen an increasing number of people fleeing violence over the years. And we've really been asking ourselves, how can we respond to these needs but without becoming a legal organization? And what we've done is we've partnered with the largest nonprofit legal services provider in the state of Arizona on a Legal Fellow program, a position that we fund. And this person comes once a week to our center and provides information on the asylum process and legal advice to the migrants who are there, and represents migrants in their asylum proceedings. She's won 3 asylum cases this year, which, and if you know how difficult it is to get asylum, that's an incredible accomplishment. One was from Nicaragua, one was from Venezuela, and I forget where the other person was from, but we're thinking of expanding this program so that we can represent more people, we can inform more people, and have a bigger impact. So I think a frequent question is, how can we help? How can we respond? And this is what happens. It's an experience that many people who come to visit us experience because, they spend days or they spend a week talking to migrants, walking in the desert, going to immigration, to federal district court where migrants are charged with a criminal offense, so that they have a criminal record, very punitive, and wonder, well, what can I do? Well, I think one thing, and I tell people, and it's a simple thing, but it's really helpful, is that what some groups have done is, and even my own nieces have done it, who are in grade school, is put together kits of travel-sized toiletries. And you say, well, why are we going to put together kits of travel-sized toiletries? Well, because particularly, when people have migrated, if they come north or they're in Nogales, they don't have a place to bathe, or it's difficult to find a place to bathe, or if they find a place to bathe, they don't have anything to use in order to address their hygienic needs. And so with that kit, it's incredibly restorative. It's a very simple thing, but it's incredibly restorative that people are able to bathe and to just address their basic needs. Another is to visit, and I think Holy Family is planning a visit for a small group of people in February. And while not everyone can come, of course, I imagine that group can come back and report. And we have found that very helpful because when groups come down, they know their community, they know their interests, they know how they're set up, they can see how we're set up, see what our needs are firsthand, and then it's a much more fruitful dialogue in terms of how do we develop deeper engagement with one another. Because when we engage with parishes and high schools and universities, we're really looking for deep institutional engagement. We're trying to do what we can on the border, but how's this parish or high school or university, how are they putting into practice what they've seen and heard and experienced? Whether it's a forum like this, or whether it's a drive for financial support or travel-sized toiletries, or whether it's some type of advocacy activity or a visit to a congressional representative, that there's a real institutional commitment to engage on this issue. And then another possibility is to sign up for our e-newsletter. And so our website is kinoborderinitiative.org. And there's a box I think you can click. That comes out once a month. It provides very good information, generally a story on a person we've served, as well as some reflection on a policy question that's current, as well as some media updates, and then a call to action. And so that can be a very helpful resource in terms of staying current on what's happening and reflecting on what one can do on an ongoing basis to respond to this reality. So I just recall what Pope Francis said to the U.S. bishops during his visit in 2015, and I think it's, again, something that really helps us imagine the border and imagine this reality of immigration in a new way. And what he said was this. He said, "We must not be taken aback by their numbers, but rather view them as persons, seeing their faces and listening to their stories, trying to respond as best we can to their situation. And so I think that's what we're asked to do. Like Monsignor said this morning, we're asked to be open. We're asked to be discerning. We're asked to grapple with this issue. And we're asked to be attentive to the movement of the Spirit of God, which is what Kino has tried to do over these years, ever since the beginnings when we participated in that needs assessment process. Because this is a very fluid reality. It's very complex, and it's ongoing. And yet, if we have that spirit of discernment, while the numbers may be high, we will find the way to respond. And we will do that in love. So I think I'll stop there and just see if there are any questions or comments. My intention, of course, was not to cover every point that has to do with immigration, but just to present a little bit about who we are, what we're seeing, what we've tried to do, and just something for our consideration in terms of imagining the border and in this reality in a new way, and especially in the context of faith.
So, in order to do that, we have a microphone here. If some people would like to come up and line up there. Is your other microphone not working?
I just find it easier to use this. So I'm soft-spoken, and so I can just put it right up against my mouth. So, unless you need it. If you need it, then I'll turn this on.
So for those who didn't want to come up to the microphone, I was going to bring that to you.
So let's see. Can you hear me now? Yes.
If we could get some people up. But for our questions time, we want to make sure that it's a question or a concern and not a preaching. Does that make sense? So we're trying to gather more information from Father Sean, who lives and has lived on the border for the last 10 years, and try to better understand the situation. And for us to bring our concerns, tonight's the night to bring our concerns and our questions forward. And he does want to address those for the next half hour or so. Okay, so if anyone wants to come to the microphone?
I'd like to know why it is that a year ago summer, there was a shift from basically men to families. What caused that?
So people from Central America have been fleeing violence for a time, and people were arriving at the ports of entry, or at least in Nogales. I can speak for Nogales, but they were entering relatively quickly. I mean, either right away or maybe within a matter of hours. So what changed, at least from what I could see, was that Customs decided to slow down significantly the processing of these people. And so it's a practice that's called metering, where they'll receive just a small number of people a day, or sometimes no one on a given day. And our issue with that is that it leaves people very vulnerable in Nogales, Sonora. It really, it limits their access to the asylum process, but when you have to wait 2.5 months there are all these people on the Mexican side of the border who want to prey on them and take advantage of them. That's been the case for years. And so when you have this group of people and they're sitting there and they really stand out and they're unable to access the process and they're already fleeing violence and they're already afraid and uncertain, it leaves them very vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. And so that's at least what I've seen in Nogales is because of that metering policy, that the numbers started to increase, and then with that, then many at the same time many families were coming north. But I'd say the increase in the number of people was due particularly to that policy.
I take it that those that are coming are seeking asylum primarily.
The majority, right now.
Right now, how many people are being allowed in, let's say, in a week? How many families? Is it 10, 20? How many?
Good question. So I would say on the average, it's about 6 families a day, at least in Nogales. So I can't speak for other parts of the border, but it's about 6 families a day, which is a very low number. I mean, when you consider that, I think as of a few weeks ago, there were 697 people so that's men, women, children waiting to present at the port of entry. So, so like I say, that's our concern. Yeah. Okay.
Is it possible that the single biggest contribution to the delay is the fact that the government has decided to prosecute it as a crime, where now that means that people are guilty of crime and they have to separate the families, whereas up until 18 months or 2 years ago, it was a civil offense and people weren't criminals who tried to come to the country?
So there are two things there, I'd say. So one is the U.S. government's been putting in practice a number of years in certain courts, in certain cities near the border, what's called Operation Streamline. So as you've mentioned, so immigration falls under civil law. And but what the government has done is they found a statute in the criminal law with regard to no trespassing and used that statute to charge people with a criminal offense. What that does is that gives them a criminal record, which makes it almost, and then when it leads to what we call what they call removal from the United States to Mexico, it makes it almost impossible for them to come legally in the future. So the point is to be very punitive and be very, very harsh. So with children, when children were being separated from their families, what was happening there was, so some of you may be familiar with a ruling in 1997 called the Flores Settlement. And what that said was that children could not be in detention for more than 20 days. So that's not the case for adults. And so what the administration said was, all right, well, if that's the case, then we're going to apply the law literally, meaning that so we can't detain children more than 20 days, but adults, yes. And so they were removing the children, putting them in the care of Health and Human Services, or detention and then Health and Human Services, and then the parent detention. But what they were doing was, and they at least if I remember the DHS secretary correctly, denied they were separating families. But they were, and that was the intent. That was clearly the intent, was to separate families, and in our view was immoral and unconscionable. And but you know, and some of that continues to go on, which we're very concerned about. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
It was a decision by the administration to change it.
yes. Yes, sorry.
Hi. Well, first, thank you for your talk today and for your homily earlier today. I think both were really inspirational and educational. And I guess my question is kind of two parts. The first is, what would you say is the biggest or most harmful misconception that people have about how things are at the border now? And then secondly, perhaps related to that, what is our obligation, our duty as Catholics and as Christians to resist the kind of racism that might be contributing to those misconceptions?
So, I mean, I would say the biggest misconception is that I mean the border's this incredibly violent place, and I mean I've lived in Nogales for almost 11 years now, and I mean yes the cartel is there, and yes they operate, but you know it's, I mean at least on the U.S. side it's very peaceful and it's very safe, and so I think that's one misconception. I'd say another one is that most of the people who are migrating, I mean, have criminal intent, if you will, and I mean my experience over these years, most are coming, like I said, for the main reasons that people come, to have a more dignified way of life, to flee violence, to reunite with family, fleeing environmental disasters. That is the vast majority. You know, it's a very small number, I think, who come with criminal intent. So I'd say that's a big misconception. And then the second part of the question was, sorry. Right. So again, as Catholics, and what roots Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person. We are made in God's image and likeness. All of us. All of us. And that gives us, that gives us a dignity that no one can take away. And so when there's any actor who's acting out of racism or prejudice of any kind, it's a violation of that person's human dignity. And so it is important to resist that. And I think in July and then last week, first in Washington, D.C., and then in Newark, the actions and those were Catholic actions to resist and protest the separation of children from their parents. It's not the only way, but I think that's one active way to resist. But I think it also it's within our purviews too. Within our lives. Unfortunately, like in Southern Arizona, and maybe it happens here too. I have met with people who've experienced abject racism. So I had dinner with someone the other night who's a person of color, and it was just they were somewhere in some public place, and this person walked up to them and said, "Well, go back to where you came from." I said, "Well, my people were here since the 1600s, So it's like, so I think, it's not just at the policy level, but it's also kind of in our own personal circles. How are we responding with respect? But just not letting those moments go by. And I do think those type of incidents are on the rise, and which means with all the more reason, we need to say, that's not right, and I'm deeply offended by what you said, and like I said, with respect, but to respond that way, like I said, not just at the policy, but at the personal level as well. So, who's next? Yeah? Okay.
You've given a very good insight tonight about the challenges at the border, and I know many of us here in the room have had very positive experiences with immigrants, to hear their story and their challenges and accompany them. But at the same time, from coast to coast, there's Catholic radio that is very much fear-mongering. It is supported by the leadership here in the Archdiocese, Relevant Radio.
Really?
And I guess, how can we as Catholics sitting in the pews respond to that and quelch that voice of hate and disrespect and lack for the dignity of immigrants?
Yeah, no, I'm really sorry to hear that. I think there are a couple ways to do that. I think just very basically on the shows. If you're able to call in, to be an alternative voice. I'm really confused about why on a Catholic radio station that those type of views would be aired or expressed. Well, I would really take that up with the Archdiocese. Really?
Yes, it's very concerning.
Huh.
And Archbishop Gomez is actually on the board of directors of that radio station.
Yeah. Well, I'm very surprised by that.
I don't think we heard the last of what you said.
Archbishop Gomez is on the board of that radio station, the board of directors. Relevant radio.
So it sounds like, you're doing what I think you're taking the appropriate steps to address that, and I would just say, and maybe you've done this already, but maybe talking to other people who are concerned about that as well, and then if you have a critical mass group of people, then really strategize about is there another step you can take to address that, because what you're describing is not, at least as I understand, the views of the Catholic Church.
She's talking about the bishop, though.
But I'm unfamiliar with this radio station, so I'm just.
That's who she's referring is to the bishop. Or
That's what she said. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, so who's going to stop it?
Well, it's a good question, right? Who is going to stop it, right?
I mean, we're not, who's doing what to stop it?
Well, I think she described that, they've called in, they've met with, or tried to meet with someone at the Archdiocese, but, I'd say ask her, But anyway, do you have a question?
Well, that was the question. Who's going to stop it? And how are we going to stop it?
Well, that's a good question.
Pardon me?
Pray.
No,
What?
we need to get together and,
Like I said, I think it's step by step. It sounds like you've taken some steps, and if you have a critical mass of people that you talk to who are really concerned about this, then you can strategize about what to do. That and maybe there's something that you want to do at the parish level, or maybe there are people from other parishes who have the same concern. And I'd say the key is trying to find the right person. I know you've tried to do that, but if it hasn't gone anywhere with that person, who's the next person you can go to try to address it? And I have to confess, I'm not sure who that is. I'm not here now, but that would be my suggestion.
I have had a lot of success with Relevant Radio. I have sent them a lot of material and things that we are very concerned about. They will send it to convents and monasteries to pray for the intentions. And some of it is the children at the border.
Yep.
And I've written to them, and I've gotten responses. And it's very beautiful.
Okay.
And they spread it, they not over the radio, but they have their own prayer group, and they send it to the different monasteries and other convents for prayer.
Well, good. Oh, good.
That's Relevant
good to hear.
Radio.
Thank you. Yes.
I have had the experience of talking to a number of people about the issues at the border, and I've heard this more than once where people will say, my ancestors came here, they did it the right way, they went through the process. How do you suggest that you approach that with someone who's really embedded in that idea that it's just a matter of doing it the right way?
Right. So I'd say one of the big concerns, and rightly so, I'd say, a central part of the culture of the United States is respect for rule of law, and obviously that's very valuable, and that's important, right? But I think while there's a tendency to blame the migrant, we tend to not look at the law. Is the law just? Is it humane? Does it respect human dignity? As I think it was Archbishop Wester, when he was Bishop of Salt Lake City, he said, it's not so much of a question of whether the migrant is breaking the law. He says, the law is breaking the migrant. The law is breaking the migrant. Which puts the focus in the right place, right? Because then then how do we adjust the law so that it's not saying we have no law and just whatever. That's not the teaching of the church, but it's how do we revise the law so that there is sovereignty, but there's also respect for human rights. And obviously there's a back and forth and disagreement about what's that mean concretely at the policy level. But I think that's an important distinction to make. So while the law is important, does the law really reflect who we are and want to be? And I think there's disagreement, and I think that is a fundamental disagreement in the United States with respect to immigration. Because it's rooted in who is the United States? And I think the more we can talk at that level, then the more traction we can get on the other questions. Because as one person said, in the end, it's a fundamental part of it is a debate about the identity of this country. Because if we think the United States is it's of a set of principles that's enriched by diversity and people who come from around the world and who are born here as well, is that the United States, or is the United States just kind of a set group of people from a certain race or a certain religion or a certain perspective? It's important to talk that out, because Because if we don't, I mean, there's disagreement here, but there are deeper disagreements that aren't being addressed. Yes.
Yes, I'm not sure if I'm going to put this question out very correctly, but I do see that a lot of immigrants that come have said to me, well, I'm a teacher, and I'm in downtown LA, so 55% of my students are immigrants just recently, and it's not like they want to be in the United States. They would like to go back to their country. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about that and you say, why are they here? Well, they're escaping so many other things, but especially poverty, hunger, and a government that is so comfortable with the, and I'm going to say it, with the regime change wars. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of our countries that have experienced that, I'm from Ecuador, so I know what that is. I know what it is, a regime change war. Yes. And how many of our immigrants, like I have Ecuadorians in New York, close to 3 million, due to the fact that the government at that time just sold out the country to the best buyer, and the people were left out with any money in their pockets, so they have to find a way to survive. That's so right. I think it comes to the point that we can help them in the border. We can provide them that dignity that they deserve because they're human beings, and I'm trying my best in the classroom to see them as, give them the best education that they can so that they can feel protected. Yes. But the thing is not how we receive them here, is how can we make a change in our government as well? Mm-hmm. And I'm blaming this on military coups. Mm-hmm. I'm blaming it on, and I'm going to be blunt, because they have attacked our Latin America countries so much that our governments are not. In Ecuador, the only time that we had peace was with a progressive leader who just left the country with hospitals. He built hospitals, he built schools, and I was born here in the United States. And I was just about to go back to Ecuador and live there and retire there and be an educator and be a teacher. Now I can't, because the fact that if I go there, the government is persecuting anybody who believed in the other government. So that's what we need to stop. We need to fight here for a true, just political system that leaves other countries alone. Let them progress on their own.
Yeah, and so many years ago, a movement developed called the School of the Americas Watch, and that emerged because they recognized that many of the places where that oppression was happening in Latin America, the officers at the higher level were trained in the United States and trained in practices that took lives and oppressed the people in nations like Ecuador. And so they've been meeting in Nogales every year. Their focus has really turned to the border because they're very concerned about the excessive militarization of the border and what that means in terms of respect for human dignity. So that's something that I've seen over the years, and like I say, and in fact, their movement has really focused on the border, and their I think real goal has been to try to shut down that school so that the U.S. is not training officers from Latin American countries in these abusive practices. Well, it has a different name. It's WINSEC now, but it was called the School of the Americas. I think WINSEC. What's that stand? It's something Western Hemisphere. I forget, but it changed names. But it's the same school, and based in Augusta, Georgia, I think. So yes.
You said there's always an increased number of families and school-age children. What are the school-age children doing for education while they're there? Very good question.
So it's been really hard for us because we bought a building, we're remodeling it, we're very space challenged, and yet that's the question, right? So you have these families and these children, what are they doing? They're not in school. So it's really hard to find alternative spaces in Nogales, and for different reasons. We've We had a weekly kind of recreational activity for the kids with volunteers, but then the park nearby, it wasn't safe anymore, so then we couldn't do that. And so we've built 2 classrooms in our current building. They were intended for job training, but what I can see happening is partnering with a local teachers college, which is just up the hill from us. I've already met with them in the past to look at possible programming, but they have students that they're graduating to be teachers, and in Mexico, to get a degree. It's Jesus again. So you have to have a certain amount of hours of social service. And so I could envision something where we're using these classrooms not just for job training, but also for some type of curriculum with these kids. We'd have to think about what we're doing with their parents while they're in class. But once we have the space, then there are all kinds of possibilities. Whereas before, we just don't have anywhere to do it. I know in Tijuana, someone improvised a bus and turned it into a classroom, which I think was very, very innovative. In our reality, I think that would be hard for us to do. But we're moving into our building this fall, and I think our hope is then to really be able to address at least some of the educational needs of these children.
I think this is a good moment to take a break from questions. There's a couple announcements here at the end, but we also want to support the work that you're doing, and so we are going to send around a basket or two. And if you'd like to put in a few dollars, whatever you can will be appreciated. It will go directly to the work that they do at the Kino Border Initiative, and to help continue the good work of walking and being with these people that need it. I once taught in a Catholic high school, and I did this program called Third World Experience, and these were young ladies, and we went down to Mexico and came back, and they said to me, one of them you always learn from your students, right? But tonight this was brought back to my attention, and this young lady said, had I been born about 200 miles south of where I've been born, my life would have been totally different. And she came to that realization, and she brought that to all of us in that group that time, and I still remember it. And so these are human beings, just happen to be in a different place, born in a different space, that are in pain, suffering, and we're trying to be of support and help to make that. So thank you for doing that. And then I think while the collection is happening, is it Jane or Campbell?
We're getting our acts together here. The best laid plans. There are sign-up sheets in the back as you're leaving tonight. We're hoping that we'll have several opportunities to be more involved with, not just with the border, but with the needs of those on the border. There will be, as Father mentioned, a small group from Holy Family will be able to go to Nogales and spend a couple of days learning about the Kino Border Initiative. We also have been, and Cambria has been in touch with people who have been going to just across the border in Tijuana. There are a number of, maybe you read, there was an article in the paper about women in Maryland suburbs of Washington, I think Potomac, Maryland. And they got together and they collected items that were needed at Catholic Charities in El Paso. And they had a kind of a party at home. It was really kind of wonderful. I was stunned at the needs that and what they had requested. You know, the diapers and some of the toothpaste and things like that. What got me is they wanted nursing bras. And that said to me a lot about the people who are coming across the border with these very young children. So there will be opportunities We don't know exactly what they are. Social Concerns Committee is going to be working with them. Cambria is working on it. We'll be talking to our friends at Dolores Mission, and we will get back to you. So if you would leave us your name and the information at the back, and there are about 5 sheets so we can get, a number of people going at the same time.
Thank you very much, Jane. So I want to say a huge thank you to Father Sean for traveling all the way from Nogales. And thank you so much for bringing something of the stories and the suffering and the tragedy of the people that are traveling here and are struggling in so many different ways, and for helping to touch our hearts and to open our hearts. Because truly there are brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, and whatever we can do to serve and to be open, to grapple with that. And it is difficult. The whole immigration situation is a challenging one for each and every one of us in different ways. But we are called to enter into the heart of that struggle, not to turn away from the face of the suffering Christ in each of those immigrant men, women, and children. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your love, for your commitment, for your sense of justice and dignity and decency. And it's a very profound gift that you brought us today. Thank you to all of you, and God bless you.